Here is supposed to be a sacred resting place of our ancestors on the island of St. Eustatius.
Welcome to the podcast Reclaiming Our Stories, Restoring Our Ties. My name is Ulysses Lopes, and you are listening to the podcast series by the St. Eustatius African Burial Ground Alliance, a grassroots organization formed as a result of the protests against the excavations on the 18th century burial ground of enslaved Africans, the Golden Rock, that were started by a team of international archaeologists in June 2021 in St. Eustatius. In this podcast, you will learn about the journey of the Alliance, its vision, and the important role that the community of Statia, the Caribbean, and the great African Diaspora serve in reclaiming our narrative, history, and identity, as well as restoring our ancestral dignity and spiritual ties. So, Annina, could you tell us how you first heard about the African Burial Grounds on St. Eustatius?
Yeah, not the way one would suspect, right? I mean, I've been working in cultural heritage and African burial grounds for up to 12 years. And the African burial grounds on St. Eustatius came to me. I mean, up until that point, I had never heard of St. Eustatius. So it was a complete shock to hear about another burial ground halfway across the world that had so many similar instances of the lack of cultural heritage preservation and the lack of support needed for a community to connect with their heritage. So at the time, which was 2021, I was still living on St. Helena Island and working on the African burial grounds there, also related to an airport project and to the unethical treatment of the human remains resulting from that airport project. And I was actually contacted by one of the members of the Alliance. They had seen one of my works posted on the internet. And one of those works was my attempt to engage the local St. Helena community to that heritage, to that site and to that memory. And 2021 is also a time when the island, St. Helena Island, was still under lockdown due to COVID. So here I was on this remote island dealing with an African burial ground that I thought was completely unique to that space, to the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. And here we are experiencing a global pandemic, and I'm contacted by a remote island in the Caribbean that almost to the exact detail was just like what I was working on. So it really shocked me that I thought we were in a unique position on St. Helena. And it really made me realize how globally connected we are as an African diaspora, but also how connected we are in our struggles for ancestral justice and also reclaiming our identity and our history.
Okay, so do you see any similarities from what I hear or any major differences with the burial grounds over there compared to what you've been exploring here on St. Eustatius?
Wow, yeah. I mean, the similarities are striking between St. Helena Island, a British overseas territory in the middle of the South Atlantic, home to 4,500 people, and, St. Eustatius, a Dutch territory in the Caribbean. And then also what connects them is the history and the stories of the enslavement of African people and the trade of enslaved Africans. And, as if that's not enough, the treatment of that space, the heritage, the relationship between the descendant communities, and that history was almost exactly the same. On St. Helena, we have a burial ground of up to 10,000 enslaved Africans in an industrial hub of the island. And what actually brought me to St. Helena was to work on an airport project as a part of the construction team. And a part of those works included the archaeological excavation of 325 bodies to make way for the airport site. So again, like the striking similarities between Statia and St. Helena, where it's not only limited to Statia and St. Helena or islands or overseas territories, but there are so many other sites around the world because our history, our stories, our people, we're everywhere around the world. And so many of these sites are threatened wherever they are because the history is neglected. It is regarded as insignificant. It has left the descendants and the ancestral communities scattered and fragmented, which means the history and the sites and its memory is vulnerable and weak to assess. And you find that the dominant narrative or the dominant holders of that narrative prey on that weakness. So whether they are developers, archaeologists, government employees that have no to little understanding of the significance of the relationship between the heritage and the community and where that's at, and they disregard it instead of seeing that this relationship needs to be restored. They see it as an opportunity to do away with it, to regard it as insignificant or negligible. And that is another similarity between Statia and St. Helena, where the vulnerability is seen as an opportunity and is preyed on by those that domineer and dominate the narrative.
Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head with that one. These burial ground sites, it definitely shows once we really find out who those ancestors really were, what traditions they followed, what spiritual beliefs they had, we would know more about ourselves because we all are the descendants of those ancestors. So I can see how the powers that be don't really focus on it in that sense and don't have the connection where, again, power and money comes into play because they don't have no connection for those things that matter to us. So I like how you touched on that there. Now that you spoke about St. Helena, Statia, and yeah, basically everywhere where the African diaspora is, what is the significance of these African burial grounds to you?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Such an important question because since I started working on African burial grounds, and that sounds, using that statement actually doesn't really do justice to how I came across or how I initiated my relationship. And that's what I refer to it as my relationship with the history, with that sacred site, with my ancestors. Because at that point, it was really due to privilege in my education, privilege in my economic status that I could afford to have a tertiary education, privilege to my color, to the language I spoke, and also to the career I chose, that I could have access to that sacred site, that I could go all the way to a remote, isolated place in the middle of the South Atlantic as a woman of African descent, the probability of that happening, in my background with archaeology and environmental science, when you put all of that into this mix of remoteness and construction, what are the chances of that happening? It was fate. And as soon as I encountered the space, the artifacts, the history, I saw something within myself for the first time, something that I hadn't seen anywhere else, that has never been so clear to me as it was in that moment. And many, many moments, because that's how rich and diverse our culture is, from the variety of our languages to the thousands of beads that our ancestors were buried with, to where they came from, the lands and the kingdoms and the queendoms. And really, what I experienced was the most human connection that I had ever felt, that did away with color and class and gender and how we place value on human life in society. That is what heritage gave to me, which I think is such a precious gift and is why I want to share it with everyone else. Because if we can, through archaeology, and I put that in inverted terms because it's such an academic, it's a profession, it's, the study of, but really I see it from a social, cultural, spiritual domain where I'm actually reconnecting with my identity, with my culture, with my past and my present, with how I connect with other people, no matter what descent they are. Because if we think about what these burial grounds represent, they are our connection to time, to each other, to ourselves, to memory, and to the land. So it's no wonder that what we're doing is so contested and it upsets so many. And it brings about so many emotions of anger and guilt and fear and denial and shame. So when I do the work that I do, I often think about what a dear friend and colleague, Peggy King Yoder, what she says is that what defines us as human, in part, is how we bury our dead. We place beads or gifts with them. We pour libations. We sing over them, sing over their bodies. In that moment, we reclaim their humanity. And even more so when in that moment, centuries ago, their humanity was at stake and they were deemed to be subhuman or less than human by society. So, in that very rare opportunity where loved ones or people closest to you were able to bury you and reclaim your humanity, that's a revolutionary act of remembrance. And if we can look into the past under this umbrella of being classified as subhuman in society, if they could do that in that time, it can surely teach us how to do that with each other now and within ourselves. And that's what I feel Burial Grounds holds for the human race right now in learning how to reclaim our humanity.
Yeah, that definitely is a powerful statement. And like I told my uncle Kenneth, we had a short little talk about the rising, of this truth in all aspects, who we are as a people, who our ancestors were, all of that is one big link, you know. The powers that be making sure that they all confederate in withholding this information, twisting stories, narratives, like you said, the issues with the burial grounds is another aspect. It's so many things that you would have to touch on to really bring out the truth. Education is another thing, the history plays another role, the spiritual belief as well. So everything in every aspect has been tampered. And I do agree with you when you say it brings up a certain level of anger, because now you're ready for justice. So it definitely gonna keep you on your toes and ready to dive in and spread this to more of our people. Otherwise, we're going to
Absolutely.
be definitely walking here, I would say sleepwalking, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
living, but no real purpose, no real identity of self. So that definitely is a good thing that you touched on there. That shows how this impacts you as well. Also about the film that you've been working on, I know you did a great job with the story of Bones, a big story about Saint Helena as well, and how you went back also to the motherland. But can you share a bit more about the film, the journey of the filmmaking process? Because this story bears a strong connection to the Caribbean folks here and the work that the Alliance is doing on St. Eustatius as well. So, yeah, just share a bit with us, give the listeners a bit
Yeah.
insight on that nice film.
So, yes, A Story of Bones basically is a full length documentary that follows my journey on St. Helena over a course of 80 years. And that's how long it takes to really get to only really just to peel back the surface layers of this history. And it basically follows my journey in encountering this history for the first time through the burial grounds and through the work I was doing on the airport project and the insights and perspectives that I viewed over that period, as well as the insights and perspectives from the local community, and also how the government mismanaged the site and the history and the story, and that relationship between the community and the burial grounds. So the filmmakers came from Britain in 2015, and they actually came to film the opening of the airport to document how this remote island would now be opening up to the world with regular flights, and how that would affect the community and their relationship with the outside world. But the airport's delayed, and they end up talking to a lot more of the residents and the communities. And they come across the story of the burial grounds in Rupert's Valley. And every time they start talking about it, people would bring up my name and be like, "Oh, you should speak to Nina because she's working on the bones and she's trying to do something about it." And yeah, we had a conversation, and that's when they decided they really want to focus on this significant part of British history, which often is not talked about. It's not taught in schools. The significance of it is not represented by the British government, but also they wanted to witness the story through a woman of African descent. And that's how it started, really. And they did their trips, the directors of the film, they did their trips between the island and the UK over the course of 8 years, many hours of footage, many conversations. And yeah, the film was released in 2022, and it's 2 years in the running now. So as a documentary, especially a documentary that touches on so many social justice themes like land rights and the restitution of African heritage, having access to cultural heritage as an African diaspora and being of African descent. The impact campaign is quite broad, it's huge. There's a global community that has to be covered. So yeah, the struggle is still on to show it to as many communities in the world, but also to protect the site on St. Helena by raising awareness and educating people. Yeah, and yeah, it just keeps growing. Like after 2 years, you think, that it would have run its course, but it feels like it's only catching momentum now. With the burial grounds on St. Helena, there are, in the records, it refers to 27,000 enslaved Africans were brought to St. Helena Island. Close to 10,000 died on the island, hence the burial grounds. 17,000 were shipped onto the Caribbean. So the connection between St. Helena and Statia, it's again a strong one. And I feel immensely connected to be able to work on these two sites and to deal with these sacred grounds, respectively. So there's a lot of ancestral and spiritual connection as well, and a lot of work that has to be done with connecting our fragmented and scattered descendants diaspora with the ancestral communities on the continent in Africa, and then the rest of us that are all over the world because of our shared history.
Yeah, I do believe once we trace back, the path where the diaspora has been sent in the various places, as they would say, the four corners of the earth, we will find a lot more history. Like you're saying, the story that Saint Helena has, and then some being sent over to the Caribbean as well, and then further on to America, South
Yeah.
America.
And
So
Brazil, yeah, the
exactly,
connections, yeah, and back to the continent, to the Congo Kingdom, yeah,
exactly.
vast.
Yeah, we see as long as you follow the path that they took,
Yeah,
we will know.
absolutely.
So one thing they can't
Absolutely.
do is hide because they have many books written, They were very proud in documenting that part. So once we follow the documentation that they left there along with the work and the stories of our own ancestors and of course, the different traditions of our people in the diaspora, you can see the similarities. We cook alike, we dress alike, we behave alike, the attitude, character, the things can't hide. They can split us
Absolutely.
up in many terms and nationalities, but
Yeah.
we all stem from that one. So, um,
Yeah.
how did you see the impact of this film? What has that done for the preservation of these sites on St. Helena? Do you see a big impact or any major changes that you can say, okay, this film really brought out the awareness?
Yeah, I mean, since the release of the film, it really took on a life of its own. I don't think we were prepared for what that would mean. I don't think anyone was prepared for what that would mean because we were really disrupting the status quo in, this dominant narrative that for so long had been managed or manipulated by those in power. And now you bring in this perspective of who are the true authorities to this heritage, to the science that comes with it, to the space, and anything that is tied to money and land causes problems, it equals politics. So the reactions were not surprising, but definitely very telling of the greater system at play, of the power dynamics, of the dominant narrative. In more structural and systematic, institutionalized senses, there was resistance to accepting the narrative as valid and as an authority, as a woman of African descent telling the story from her emotional and spiritual perspective. That was like, there's no room for that in this conversation. We've never gone there. This is about science and land and economic development and construction. And then there's also the very interesting aside of when you share the story with descendant or ancestral communities, how grateful and how shocked people are that this is the first time they're hearing about this. Like almost like society has let them down, been selling them an untruth. Because I mean, it's a documentary, it's facts that might be stitched together creatively, but nothing that you see in that film was fabricated. So that is a harsh reality for some to face. And even through few people's responses to the film, you see these emotions of anger, or guilt, or shame, or denial, or grief, actual grief, people weeping in the film because it has accessed a part within them that they had never been in contact with. I don't think I could have imagined how the film could contribute to the long campaign for the restitution of African heritage to the continent. Sharing the story with the kings of Congo, telling them about their history on St. Helena was an obligation for me as having spent 12 years on St. Helena and participating in this, or, engaging in this relationship with the site. I would not have been able to sleep at night if I didn't return to the ancestral community. And really, my hope is to share the whole story with the world because it's human history. It's one of the greatest crimes against humanity. And there's just so many stories that are being left untold and so many sacred spaces that are being wiped out because of this narrative not given its platform.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot of work there to be shared and digged up. And one thing for sure, when this truth comes out, there's always going to be a party not happy and one will be
Yeah.
rejoicing. So, you know, I don't feel no type of way when it comes to that because it was nice when it was them, So, yeah, and at least for now, we can say this is just the part of exposing the truth. We're not even talking about retaliating in no kind of way. This is just really us trying to get the word out there, rise the people, get them back to their true identity, because otherwise, as you've seen in St. Helena, and I can testify to that for Statia and many other Caribbean islands, you're going to have people who just don't know their identity. The only thing that they will know is the island that they are on right now, and that's it. They don't know where their grandparents came from, how they got here, what was the reason they got here. So with all those missing stories, it definitely gonna cause a whole problem in society among our people. Like they say, we're the last ones. So it's time for us to rise and get back into that consciousness of who we are. Well, seeing that this film has been, rising up many people, and it's not only happening in St. Helena, but across the entire diaspora. How do you see this film helping the communities here in Statia in dealing with their own difficult histories, like I said, tied to colonialism and slavery, and also the legacies that persist in society today?
Yeah, I'm grateful for the power of storytelling and stories. I hope that through the authenticity of the film and its attempts to humanize our engagement with sacred sites and our traumatic history, that number one, I hope that stations and other communities will feel and recognize and realize that they are not alone, that this is a global plight. As many fingers are pointing at you, there's 10 more pointing back at who's ever doing the pointing. And I hope it makes them brave to address and investigate and really get back to, because at the end of the day, as you said, Uli, if you look at the means that were used to break us and you retrace those steps and you deconstruct and decolonize, one of the main things that we have to do is reconnect as a diaspora, as a people of African descent. And I think, and I hope that, like the story of St. Helena and a story of bones reflects on that. I hope it doesn't isolate these communities into their feelings of shame and guilt and anger, that it actually forces them to go past those feelings and reconnect with the continent and with the diaspora. Because we all hold fragments of the story. And then only in stitching and lacing it back together, all the stories, will we be able to restore our full humanity. And that goes to the descendants of the colonials too. the descendants of the enslavers. There is a history and a reckoning to be done there too. We can work on our part and reclaim our narrative and our spaces and our memory. But there's also work to be done in the descendants of the, and I don't like using the word perpetrators, when we talk about shared history, but there's also work to be done there. So I would hope that, number one, this film goes back to a reconnection, a reclaiming of an identity, and going back to the source. Where did we all come from? Where did this all start? What was this all about? Land and money and using people and trading in human life. How did we get there? How did we get where we are today? And that does away with color, but really speaks to the human behind all of it.
Yeah, one thing I can say for myself is you definitely have to go through the emotions yourself, whether it's the anger part or just being glad that you're finally getting closer to your identity. I believe the feeling you get from that will lead you in the right direction to really spread this and live it according to how you would have been. And I say that to say is you would live according to how you are, your own identity.
Yeah.
Because I could imagine for you moving back to the motherland, it hits different, than being in various European countries. I myself moved back to Statia 4 years now, but I could definitely see the differences between our people who grew up there, the mindset, the identity, everything is different. And it also is different for those here as well, because there's still a lack of identity and all of those things. So with more awareness on these matters, it will bring you through that emotional roller coaster, but I believe at the end it will make you grasp onto your true self. So that's one good thing. And I know this film will help with that. Where can people find this film if they would like to view it?
Yeah, so we're bringing the film to Statia. It's been screened on Statia a few times. So I will also be visiting the island in November. We'll do a few film screenings and find other more creative ways of making the film available. At the moment, there is a shorter version of the film, which is about 29 minutes long, that's available on the web through the Guardian Cotton Capital Project. And then later in the year, we will have it released on streaming platforms, so it's accessible to the globe. But yeah, we're trying to engage with descendant communities directly in order to galvanize this grassroots reconnection and networking amongst the diaspora when it comes to our heritage, because we are living in the decade for the people of African descent, as claimed by the UN. But I mean, the desecration of our burial grounds is happening in that decade, which means we still have a lot more work to do when it comes as the United Nations, as governments, as a global community.
Since you moved back to the motherland, what was the reason for that? And also, how has your view on the work you've been doing changed since you moved to St. Helena 12 years ago?
Yeah, so a year ago, I moved back to Namibia. So I'm originally from Namibia, and that's where I live now. And that was after spending 12 years on St. Helena. 13 years ago, first going to St. Helena, I was 24, young and restless, no responsibilities, also no identity. Like you said, there's no sense of who am I, where am I from, why am I, just basic questions. I knew what society had boxed me as: woman of color, young, all these economic classes and all these labels that we place on each other that society expects us to be, but no sense of who I really was. And only through working through the burial grounds and the sacred space and this history, and learning from how people engage with the heritage and people from different backgrounds. And I felt that, with the way things were, on the island, of the release of the story, the film, and the work that still needed to be done. Moving back to the continent felt like the next logical step for being able to build a network to support what was required on St. Helena. I think I was very naive to believe that the work could be done alone or in isolation or by the St. Helenian community, when actually there's a greater diaspora, there's a greater ancestral community that needs to be engaged and need to participate in the heritage. So yes, moving back has been very difficult. I mean, after living on St. Helena for 12 years is a proper amount of time. And I don't regret it because it answered even more questions about who I am. I thought that my growth on St. Helena, my awakening on St. Helena was my origin story, and not realizing that my origin story actually came from the continent. It came from my mother and father. It came from my history in apartheid in Namibia. It came from my history in a genocide carried out by the colonial forces on Namibian soil, the first genocide of the 20th century. And I'm a descendant of that. Before I went to St. Helena, I thought that my mother tongue was Afrikaans and my first language is English. And then I realized my mother tongue is Nama Damara. And I don't speak it and I don't understand it, but that is the legacy of my history. So I've learned a lot. I've learned that I am more than the past 12 years. My response to St. Helena and the burial grounds was natural. It was in my DNA. I was always going to resist that narrative and not claim it as truth because of who I am and where I come from.
Yeah, that definitely is a powerful journey you have going on there. And like you said, we all hold fractions of these stories. So what does the relationship look like between the descendant communities or tribes, as I would like to call it, and their heritage on the continent? Is the reduction of African heritage, as they would say, a global phenomena?
The first time I learned about the genocide burial grounds in Namibia was in 2021, I think, when I came back home. So I didn't learn about it in primary school or secondary school. And then coming to Swakopmund, Namibia, and visiting the burial grounds there, you could literally say it's exactly like the story of Statia and St. Helena. Neglected, abandoned, not maintained. Literally, the desert is consuming the burial grounds there. Housing developments are encroaching on the space. So it really is a global plight that we're in. It's all over, where this heritage is seen to be insignificant, even though, and it's got nothing to do with time, because not enough time has passed for those remains to disappear or for their descendants to be gone. It is just not a comfortable history to talk about. And also, unfortunately, it is dominated and consumed by the narrative and discussion and discourse around reparations and, government negotiations. And even in those government negotiations, the descendant communities and the indigenous communities are left out of that. Very similar to the Dutch apology to slavery, where no mention is made of the African continent, and the descendant communities in the Caribbean were excluded from that process of, coming up with this Dutch apology. So it's very similar, but I will say that these indigenous and ancestral communities, kingdoms and queendoms or tribes, they are hungry for their heritage. They are looking for it. they are ready for it. All this conversation about the future of African heritage has nothing to do with the continent, because the continent is incapable of managing its own heritage. And this is what people believe. This is the narrative that's being sold. And I have seen the exact opposite. They are more capable than the European museums that have human remains and artifacts in storage in bunkers for decades. They don't even know what's in there. Our people have placed more value and always have placed more value in our heritage than anyone else has. And that narrative is a lie. Our heritage has always belonged to us.
Yeah, it definitely is something when you hear how much has been left behind and the narrative that they push about Africa in itself, is just mind blowing to know how the narrative has been twisted. And like you say, the different African kingdoms and queendoms, eager to learn and share their heritage, seeing that, yeah, they live it. It isn't something that is written in a book. This is something we learn from a book, but they live it,
Yes. And it's not something separate to us. For them, it's other. It's not a part of who they are. And that is what I experienced when I encountered the history, the story, the memory, and the space on St. Helena. I couldn't put words to it, but it was always a part of who I was.
Yes, it's definitely true. Well, I would like to say thanks for having you here on the podcast today. Definitely shared some good information and some history about St. Helena on your journey there, the 12 years. It definitely hits home for me, and I know that will be the same for many others. It's definitely about us. That's no doubt. So it's definitely going to connect with many of our people who tune in. And I hope, like you say, that, it will move them to, we look forward to another episode. And we will speak to you again, and look forward to seeing more of your work as well, followed up by the story of bones.
Thank you. And I look forward to coming to the island. I'm really excited about that and meeting everyone.
Yeah, for
and I hope everyone
sure.
shows
Look
up.
forward to meeting you as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Ali.
All right, then. Thank you once again for joining us. My name is Ulysses Lopes, and you were listening to a podcast episode of the St. Eustatius African Burial Ground Alliance, reclaiming our stories, restoring our ties.